The 7th of May, 1998. The second-floor apartment at 251 South 23rd Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 2 a.m. A call came into the police. A neighbour had heard something concerning. A woman was screaming from her apartment. Shannon Schieber was screaming for someone to help her. The neighbour ran and banged on the door saying he was going to call 911 immediately. He told the operator he could hear a choking sound.
My next door neighbor, I just heard a yell for help, and I knocked on the door and I just heard like a choking type sound, and I called an apartment.
The call was a priority 1 call, the highest classification for someone in need of help. The neighbour then ran downstairs to the couple who lived below Shannon, hoping that with more than one person they would be able to break down the door and help her. The woman who lived in that apartment said that her fiancé was away working, so Shannon's neighbour went back upstairs to wait for the police to get there. When the officers arrived 7 minutes later, the woman in the apartment below Shannon's led them upstairs, and as Shannon's apartment was now quiet, they suggested that nobody was actually in there. The neighbour from across the hall was adamant he had heard a voice that sounded like Shannon's, screaming for help, and the woman in the apartment below said she had most definitely heard a scuffle. The police suggested that maybe the scream had come not from Shannon's apartment, but from outside on the street. One of the officers then headed outside and used his flashlight to illuminate her balcony. The curtains were drawn and the door was shut. No amount of talking would convince the officers to break into her apartment. They said if they heard anything coming out of the apartment to immediately call 911, and within 5 minutes, the police had left. That evening, Shannon had been up studying hard for her final finance class exam, as the first year of her doctoral program came to an end. She was due to meet with a study group at 9 o'clock the following day, have lunch with her brother Sean, then after taking her test, head home to Maryland to see her parents. When Shannon's brother Sean arrived for lunch, friends from the study group said that she had failed to turn up, and nobody had been able to get hold of her. Sean drove over to Shannon's and noticed that while the curtain to her balcony was closed, the balcony door was open. He rang her bell. No response. He immediately went to his friend Samantha's house to call his mother Vicky. Vicky said to go straight back to Shannon's building and find someone to let him in. Sean and Samantha went back and began ringing every doorbell in the building until one person came to the door, the neighbour who had called the police the previous night. Sean explained that his sister had failed to turn up for a study class and no one had heard from her. The neighbour suddenly went pale. He explained that during the night, he had heard screams for help and a choking sound, but he hadn't been able to convince the officers to go into her apartment. With not a moment to lose, they went straight to Shannon's apartment and broke down the door. 23-year-old Shannon Schieber was lying, naked, face down on her bed. She had been raped and murdered. Sean collapsed when he found her body. Samantha called Vicky, who in turn called her husband, Sylvester, to tell him what had happened to their daughter. Shannon Schieber was a gifted child, and this had shown itself very early on. By 18 months old, she was able to recite the alphabet and say it backwards. By the age of 3, she was reading at a level most second graders could read at. She was happy, bright and inquisitive, someone who always wanted to learn and know as much as she could. She was consistently top of her class and served as president of her high school, speaking in front of the city council in support of funding for education.
I am a senior in the Student Government Association president at Bethesda Chevy Chase High School this year. In November, my friend Stephanie and I were the only students to testify at your public hearing on the energy tax. I am here once again to testify for education funding in the FY93 budget.
She even got to meet President George H.W. Bush as he sought re-election. Shannon would later be accepted into Duke University, where she was also president of her freshman class and co-captain of the equestrian team, having excelled in horseback riding too. 3 years later, she graduated with an incredible triple major in economics, philosophy, and mathematics. Alongside her incredible academic achievements, Shannon had a strong moral compass and a deep commitment to social justice. When, at the age of 22, she earned a full scholarship to the prestigious Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, her aim was to have a career in finance to help those most in need. Before starting in her program, she and her father made the trip from Maryland to Philadelphia to speak with the housing office to try and find a nice, safe place in town for her to live. They were recommended Center City. It was where a lot of the grad students lived and was deemed to be a safe part of the city. That day, they found an apartment she loved and put a deposit down. In early May, just a few days before her death, Shannon was followed around Rittenhouse Square by a man. She had walked round and around trying to lose him so he wouldn't see where she lived, or try and gain access to her apartment. Little did she or anyone know there was a serial rapist on the loose. The modus operandi was always the same. The victim would be a young woman of college age. The attacker would break into their apartment before blindfolding and attacking them. June 20th, 1997, the 200 block of South 21st Street. A woman told police that a man had broken into her apartment via a window. He climbed on top of her, but she had been able to persuade him not to rape her. She was even able to provide the police with one of his hairs, but this hair was not tested for 18 months. July 11th, 1997, the 2100 block of Pine Street. After going for a night out with friends, the victim went home and climbed into bed. She would later be awakened to find herself with wet hair and stripped naked. Her neck had bruises and the blood vessels in her eyes were burst. It was initially called a burglary by the police. August 6th, 1997, the 1600 block of Pine Street. The victim told police that as she had slept, a man had climbed through her window, put a pillow cover over her face and a belt around her neck, before raping her and fleeing. The stains on the sheet were tested, but they were not linked to any other victims until January of 1999, as the DNA from each case had been held on 2 incompatible computers. August 13th, 1997, the 1700 block of Pine Street. A woman had woken up to find a man in her bedroom. He put one hand on her neck and another over her mouth. He put a pillow over her face and raped her. DNA taken from this scene was linked to the attack from the 6th of August. As the police looked into Shannon's murder, they tried to piece together what had happened on the night she was killed. After studying, she had started running a bath for herself, leaving a paper on the side, and settled in to relax for the evening. Her second-floor apartment had a small balcony door, and the tree near the balcony had barbed wire coiled around it to avoid people climbing the tree and gaining access to her balcony. It seemed that what the intruder had done was press his way up the gap, which was just 3 feet, between her building and next door, before swinging onto her balcony. Her screen door was locked, but to combat the humidity, the balcony door was open. It was clear that Shannon had fought her killer. Books had been knocked off from where they had been at the side of her bed. She had also managed to draw blood from the assailant, which was on the wall, bed and balcony. He had also stolen several items, including a pen, a camera and jewellery. On the evening after Shannon's murder, her parents arrived at the apartment at around 7 p.m. The street was heaving with police cars and journalists. They pushed past the media outlets who insensitively threw questions at the grieving couple, and then met with 2 detectives from the Philadelphia Police's homicide unit. Her parents were then taken to the station to be questioned separately about Shannon, and if they knew of anyone who had wanted to harm her. They were then told that they would need to stay overnight as Shannon's body would need to be identified the next day. They were due to be taken to the morgue at 9 a.m. but weren't picked up until 1:30, which therefore delayed the autopsy until 5 p.m. By this point, the coroner's office was closed for the weekend, so her devastated parents were told they would not be able to release Shannon's body until Monday. After calls to various officials, they were able to have their daughter's body released to them on Saturday morning, so they could begin preparations for her funeral. As the investigation continued, the Philadelphia police issued flyers to various shops in search of the Canon camera that had been stolen from her apartment on the night she was murdered. Also stolen were hundreds of CDs, a pen, jewellery and a backpack. A fellow student from Wharton was questioned, but DNA soon ruled them out. Vicky and Sylvester, Shannon's parents, as devout Catholics, turned to their faith in the face of such immense pain. We went to Mass on Saturday evening and the assistant pastor announced at the beginning before the Mass started what had happened to Shannon. We go into the Mass and I got myself in trouble when we got to the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, the prayer reads. In the Catholic Mass you say that out loud. I'm a pretty literal guy, words mean things to me. I couldn't say that out loud, Sylvester said. A week after her death, Vicky and Sylvester were allowed to clear out her apartment, and they were also given an update. Based on the evidence found at the scene, they said once they caught the man responsible, he would almost certainly be subject to a first-degree murder charge. The police had initially believed that her killer was an ex-suitor and this had been a so-called crime of passion, but this didn't yield any leads at all. In the autumn, Shannon's case was featured 3 times on America's Most Wanted in the hope that someone would come forward with something. It seemed like her case wasn't really going anywhere. That was until a call was made. But it wasn't made to the police. It was made to the Philadelphia Inquirer. An anonymous source wanted to give them some information about the investigation into Shannon's murder. The person said that the police had blown off 2 similar attacks on women who had been assaulted in their own homes, but not killed. The anonymous source said that had the police picked up on the pattern earlier, maybe they would have been able to stop him before his crimes had escalated to murder. The journalists decided to dig deeper into these claims, and what they found was alarming. It was revealed that there was a culture where victims of rape were ignored and belittled. Detectives had filed away rape cases under a non-criminal classification code, meaning that many went unaddressed. One former detective with the Philadelphia police had referred to the sex crimes unit as the lying bitches unit, and said publicly that women lied about rape about half the time. It was only after 2 years and the series of investigations by the Philadelphia Inquirer that the police admitted this was not just isolated sloppiness, but a serious issue with culture and attitude within the force. Linking the attacks to the one offender alone had taken the police 17 months, in spite of the same MO each time, and DNA left at the scene in each instance. DNA was tested in 2 of the cases, but only following the report from the Philadelphia Inquirer. Both of these cases, the journalists learned, had been classified as non-crimes. These investigations by the Philadelphia Inquirer would go on to be nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. 2 of the previous rapes had been filed under the classification 2701. 2701 was a non-criminal category. It was deemed to be trivial and not in need of further action by the police. And as a result of these investigations, every single case filed under 2701 from the last 5 years due to the statute of limitations were looked into again. 863 were reclassified as other sexual offences. 681 were reclassified as rape. Sylvester said that it was his belief that the intention of the killer had not been to murder Shannon, but when he heard the officers knocking at the door, he had strangled her to silence her, and then escaped via the balcony. He added that had the public been warned about the serial sex attacks, she wouldn't have chosen to live there. If the previous rapes had been pieced together and connected to the same person, one can only imagine if the response may have been different. One of the officers who had gone out to her apartment that night would later say that he would have called for the supervisor if he had known the call was about a woman who had been screaming for help. The other officer said that only if he had heard the screams himself would he have forced the door open. It would take the detectives 8 months to link the 5 rapes from the one area. A former police chief would later remark that the department had been god-awful in dealing with sex crimes, and reform was long overdue. One of the victims had been able to catch a glimpse of her attacker, and a composite sketch was drawn up, and a reward would also be offered of $40,000. In July of 1999, FBI profilers were brought on board. The profilers believed that this man was very familiar with his surroundings and the wider neighbourhood. He was fit and agile and likely had a history of voyeurism. 15 months after Shannon was killed, the man now dubbed the Center City Rapist struck again. He removed 14 screws from a set of bars to gain entry into an apartment on the ground floor and attacked the woman inside. Shannon's family would talk to the parents of the victim and offer their support. One of the officers working on the case had seen an episode of Forensic Files where a serial rapist had been caught using geographic profiling. It had to be worth a shot. He reached out to the profiler who had appeared in the episode, Kim Rosmo, hoping he would be able to help. By foot and by helicopter, Kim had looked at the area in question, and then he put the addresses of the rape victims and Shannon's address into his program, which was able to provide several areas that the rapist was likely to live in. The police went to those areas and put up the composite sketch of the man they were looking for, but then the attacks suddenly stopped. By this time, the police in Philadelphia had come to the realization that these attacks had been committed by one individual. It was the diligence of one nurse conducting a forensic medical exam that had cracked it. He had licked the victim's breast, and the nurse had meticulously swabbed her, which finally picked up his DNA. The rapes would soon start up again, though. More women would be attacked, but hundreds of miles away, in a different state. Fort Collins, Colorado, May 10th, 2001. A woman had woken up to a man in her apartment. He had tied her up, covered her eyes, and sexually assaulted her. Within just a few weeks, there would be another attack, on the same street. The victim's husband, who was tragically dying from cancer, and their son had gone away camping and she was home alone. The man stood outside and watched, trying to see if there was a dog or a man in the apartment. While she sat at her computer, she heard a noise that made her stop. He quickly launched his attack. He covered her eyes and forced her into the bedroom. He calmly whispered that if she cooperated, he wouldn't hurt her. She said she remembered thinking that she needed to get through this for her son. He couldn't lose both his parents. After the attack, he ran away and she was able to call 911. The attacks continued in Fort Collins, but he had started leaving evidence, like a hat, DNA, and someone had also seen his car driving away. During one of the attacks, he left fingerprints on the balcony. The fingerprints and descriptions of the attacker were sent to police agencies throughout the United States to see if any of the departments had dealt with anything similar or had any further information on file. A police clerk in Philadelphia picked up on this and immediately thought of the Center City rapist. The DNA taken from the rape test kits in Colorado were compared to the blood in Shannon's apartment. It revealed the truth. They had been committed by the same person. They scoured databases to find men who had been in the areas in question at the time of the attacks and murder. 319 men were identified as having made financial transactions in Philadelphia, then in Fort Collins during the times in question. They looked at men between 20 and 30 years old that had been living in that part of Philadelphia to try and narrow the pool down, which it did, to 83 people. The list was sent to police in Colorado. This was combined with the lists of suspects the police had made there, a list that had more than 800 people on it. But before they could be checked, the rapist struck again. And in September of 2001, the police in Colorado received a letter. Part of it read, "I'm sorry, but I can't let you catch me yet. Not in Colorado. I don't even like it here. I'm not a fan of cold weather. I don't even like going up to Fort Collins anymore. You guys are everywhere, I admit. I want to get caught. I don't like what I do. It keeps me at a distance from people and I can't talk to anyone. It gets lonely." The letter also contained details that had not been released to the public. These were things that only the assailant, the victim, and the police knew. Frustratingly for the detectives, there were no fingerprints or DNA on the envelope or letter. It was determined that this was a ploy from the offender to throw the detectives off track and make them focus on the letter that wasn't going to yield any results. With the DNA showing that the crimes had been committed by one person and knowing that there was a 5-year statute of limitations on rape under Pennsylvania law, the authorities filed a warrant against the unknown attacker. More than 1,000 tips had come in, one of which was from a woman who said she had dated a man who looked like the person on the sketch. His name was Troy Graves. Another tip came through. A neighbour thought the car used by the rapist was similar to that of her neighbour's. Her neighbour's name was Troy Graves. This was a name also on the suspect list. In Philadelphia, he had worked for a bank near to where the victims of the Center City rapist had lived. Troy had joined the armed forces in 1999 and did basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, and also attended a missile maintenance school in California. He eventually ended up in Wyoming. A month after he arrived at the Air Force Base, he had been reprimanded after an allegation was made that he had tried to enter the dorm room of a female Air Force captain. On some occasions, he would break into someone's apartment, watch them for 15 minutes and then leave. Although he was based in Wyoming, he lived in Fort Collins, Colorado, just a couple of miles away from where the women had been attacked. An ex-girlfriend told the police that he had struggled with sleep and would take walks late at night, coming home with scratches and bruises. She was concerned and tried to get him to explain what was going on, but he wouldn't and gave various excuses such as falling over. The officers knew that the man who had killed Shannon had A-positive blood, the same blood type as Troy Graves. Detective Neil Heist had been dispatched to Troy's house on Ash Drive. Nobody was home, so he left a business card. Troy had been married for about a year, and when his wife got home and found the card, she called Detective Heist. She explained that her husband was working on the base, but had a dental appointment at 3 o'clock. She called Troy, who in turn got in contact with the police and agreed to go in to talk to detectives. He left the base to go and pick his wife up before heading to the station, not knowing he was already being followed by officers.
No criminal history. Any other problems on the base that I need to know about? There's an incident that happened on the base in May 2001.
Okay.
You didn't tell me about that.
Okay.
Why didn't you tell me about that?
Because it didn't have any key of it.
Detective Heist asked if he would be willing to be fingerprinted. He said he felt a little weird about it and wanted time to think.
So back down to the last question about your fingerprints and DNA.
See, I want to. Could I get back to you on that? And actually come in on another day, just so I can just talk to my wife and stuff. It just make me feel more comfortable. Am I still free to leave?
Yes.
I'd like to just go home and get some sleep, sir. I apologize.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what. At this point right here, you're no longer free to go. Okay. I'm going to detain you.
When his fingerprints were taken, the pieces of the puzzle would finally fall into place. This matched the set of prints found from the victim's balcony in Colorado. His blood was also taken, and this was a match for the DNA found in Shannon's apartment.
What you do is go ahead and turn around for me. You lock your hands behind your head. Spread your feet for me. You got any weapons on you that it needs to be aware of? None?
None.
On the 23rd of April 2002, 29-year-old Air Force Senior Airman Troy Graves was arrested in connection with 6 sex attacks in Colorado. 3 days after his arrest, he was charged with 27 counts, including sexual assault, robbery, and kidnap. Also that day, he was presented with the charges that had been filed against him in Philadelphia. The 50 counts included rape, aggravated assault, burglary, and murder. It later emerged that one of his ex-girlfriends had seen the composite sketch, as had her little girl, who had pointed at the poster and said, "Mummy, that's Troy." It was also revealed that Troy, who had lived at the 4100 block of Baltimore Avenue in Philadelphia, had been stopped by the police for questioning in January of 1999, but was released not long after. It wasn't clear initially where he was going to be tried first, and while the process of extraditing him to Pennsylvania had already got underway, the final decision would lie with the Colorado governor. Not long after he was arrested, he told his lawyer that if the death penalty was taken off the table, he would enter pleas of guilty to the rape and murder of Shannon and the rapes and sexual assaults against the other women. He also finally confessed to what had happened that night in Shannon's apartment. He told detectives that he had climbed through the sliding glass door of her balcony and surprised her as she was in the bathroom. After the attack, she had tried to fight him off, biting his left ring finger, drawing blood, and she also scratched his face. Troy said he put his arms around her neck to overpower her and stop her, but she fell off the bed. I countered by jumping back on the bed, on my knees, which didn't allow her feet to touch the floor. Okay, it was at that point I thought I might have broken her neck. He then said he heard someone knocking at her door 2 separate times, but said he didn't hear the police knock. He also said he didn't see the police as he ran off. He said that he had closed her balcony door, and although it was shut when the police got there initially following the call from the neighbour, Sean said that when he went to her apartment, the balcony door was open. The Schieber family argued that this suggested he was still in the apartment when the police got there, and left the door open after he fled. At a news conference, the district attorney Lynn M. Abraham gave a new explanation for this discrepancy. Sean had opened the door because he was sick at the sight of Shannon's body. Sean rubbished these claims, saying, "That's just absolutely preposterous." He added that he had noticed her door open from the outside before he even went in, and that he didn't go near the balcony door. The friend who was with him when her body was found also said in a deposition that she too had noticed the balcony door was open before going inside. Although his daughter's killer had now been caught, Sylvester said that the Philadelphia police was in need of change. That part of the case is closed, but the city of Philadelphia needs to change the way it does its policing, he said. As already mentioned, one of the punishments on the table in Pennsylvania was the death penalty. Rooted in their Catholic faith, Vicky and Sylvester were deeply opposed to capital punishment. It was reported that Shannon's family had faced what was referred to as unrelenting pressure to seek the death penalty against Troy. Vicky referred to the experience as being re-victimised by the debate around capital punishment, and how some felt it was the only way for them to receive justice. The death penalty wasn't going to honour Shannon's life, and it wasn't going to bring her back. I thought about everything we ever taught Shannon to believe, to turn the other cheek, to show compassion and be forgiving. If you have a set of principles and then don't live by them when you're tested, Were they ever your principals to begin with, she said. Sylvester said, during our 49 years of marriage, Vicky has often accused me of being too literal, but I believe words have meaning and should be taken seriously. Upon reflection, I took the meaning of, as we forgive those who trespass against us, and the teaching of St. Matthew's Gospel, telling us to turn the other cheek, to be fundamental Christian principles. Some ask, what would Jesus do? Often the answer isn't as easy as the question suggests. For us, when it comes to executions, the answer is clear. As we thought through the issues and reflected on our upbringing, we decided we would not be party to a death penalty prosecution. Vicky said that after her death, Shannon was sitting on her shoulder, telling her, don't let him kill all of you too. She was telling me to take all that energy and do good with it. She said that by going for the death penalty, she felt it would murder her at the same time as him, by taking another life to satisfy one's own ends. Shannon's parents also made contact with the victims of Troy Graves from Colorado and Pennsylvania, and they were all in support of the couple in not asking for the death penalty. Troy's attorney thanked Shannon's family for their public and vocal opposition to capital punishment. This vocal opposition became the focus of much media interest. In one instance, a talk radio host and local lawyer, Michael Smercornish, published an open letter addressed to Vicky in the Daily News. He said that Shannon's killer should pay with his life, saying he did not believe that any one citizen's feelings should determine that decision, even if that citizen is a victim. That would result in disparate sentencing in society. Society's interest requires serious consideration of a death sentence. We never want another promising young woman to have her life cut short by a murderous thug, but we must consider the deterrence that a death sentence in this case might provide. Sylvester and Vicky wrote an open letter back, explaining their opposition to capital punishment. Firstly, as Catholics, they held life to be sacred. Under the circumstances of our daughter's death, our beliefs about appropriate punishment have been severely tested, but we have no choice but to adhere to our principles. Secondly, they said that capital punishment was often applied in discriminatory and arbitrary ways in our society. And finally, they said that the issues with the police in failing to link the offences and classifying reports of rape and sexual assault as non-crimes had resulted in a failure to warn the community and added to the risk for people who lived there. They referenced Shannon being followed around just 2 nights before she was killed. Had she known that a serial rapist was working her neighbourhood, she would have been far more concerned about this incident than she was. She likely would have called the police, the open letter said. They added that if Smercornish wanted safety for the community, he should have called for accountability from the police regarding their handling of cases linked to the Center City rapist, and for changes in how they deal with sex attacks. Shannon's family also took legal action against the Philadelphia police for negligence. The federal lawsuit said that the police had missed the opportunity to save her or catch Troy Graves when the call from the neighbour had come in. The lawyer for the family had told the federal jury that if police in Philadelphia had recognised that the crimes were being committed by one person or taken sex offences more seriously, Shannon's murder could have been prevented. He told the jury that the officers had originally misclassified one of the sex attacks as a burglary. Some of the forensic evidence hadn't been analysed. Allegations of rape had been downgraded or ignored, and police weren't aware of a serial offender. The Chief Deputy City Solicitor Shelley R. Smith said that the police had acted properly and the city was not responsible for Shannon's death. In 2004, it was reported that the city of Philadelphia was not liable for the death of Shannon Schieber, following her family's lawsuit against them. Sylvester was deeply critical of the police department in Philadelphia. I think the police department in Fort Collins from the beginning of the attacks comported themselves in an extremely professional manner, which should be an embarrassment to Philadelphia. He argued that very few were holding the police to account. They won't clean it up, and someone needs to demand they clean it up. On the 17th of May 2002, Troy Graves received a life sentence in Fort Collins, Colorado, for the sexual assaults against 7 women. The district judge, Terrence Gilmore, dealing with the cases in Colorado, said he had decided on a life sentence because of the nature of the offences and the level of fear he had instilled in his victims. It was now time for Troy Graves to face justice in Philadelphia. He entered a plea of guilty to 6 counts of rape and to the murder of Shannon Schieber. He told the court to the city of Philadelphia and the victims and the families and friends of the victims, "I'm sorry. My deepest sympathy to the Schieber family for their loss, and I thank them for how they've been throughout this." As the court proceedings played out, the second victim of Troy Graves sat at the back of the courtroom. She had been attacked in July of 1997. She'd woken up to find herself covered in bruises and naked. Her case had initially been classed as a burglary. As the details of her case were read out, she broke down in tears. She said after the hearing, "I'm glad it's over." Judge Benjamin Lerner sentenced Troy Graves to life in prison with no possibility of parole for Shannon's murder, plus 60 to 120 years for the rapes. Shannon's parents welcomed the life sentence. That's exactly what we wanted. We didn't want Graves having the flexibility of ever attacking anyone else again, and that's the satisfaction we got, Sylvester said. One thing that had been made so abundantly clear during this investigation was that there needed to be a massive change in the police. An external oversight committee was set up which independently reviewed how the police handled cases of rape. Making up the committee were experts in women's legal rights, advocates for children, and staff from the Rape Crisis Centre. Carol Tracy, the executive director of the Philadelphia-based Women's Law Project, was asked by the Philadelphia police to help in the creation of the committee, and became a leading member. It brought transparency and independent scrutiny at a time when the public had lost confidence in the police. It is another model departments should learn from, she said. The committee looked into rape reports that had been classified as unfounded, which meant that the report was deemed to not meet the criteria for rape or sexual assault, or that it had been made up. In the late 90s, the police would file almost a fifth of cases away as unfounded. This was alongside the hundreds that had been incorrectly classified under wrong codes and then buried. The sex crimes unit used by the police was originally based in a former horse stable and then in a disused military armoury. After having invasive and difficult forensic exams at the hospital, victims would then have to sit and wait in police corridors, often seeing their alleged attackers sat there in handcuffs. One of those who took part in the initial case review was Lieutenant Tom McDevitt. I remember the day I said, "How did we get this bad? What did we do?" It was eye-opening, like a smack in the face to us. It was a humbling thing that we said, wow, if we really want to be this good, we have to change. Senior Philadelphia sex crimes officer, former Lieutenant Michael Boyle, said, people had become complacent, officers were being careless and in many cases lazy, and weren't even looking at cases as individual women, but just as a filing code or an overwhelming workload. The culture of police was not helped by a lack of supervision and oversight, poor training and little funding. Boyle called the attitude that had developed inexcusable and indefensible. If you look in the city of Philadelphia, there were positive developments. For us, it came at a tremendous cost, Sylvester said. The reforms seen in the handling of sex crimes in Philadelphia were also implemented in other places, like New York and even Ottawa, Canada, where independent groups reviewed how investigations were carried out. Since 2016, the Ottawa Rape Crisis Centre had launched 12 pilot programs, all based on the model used in Philadelphia. Sylvester and Vicky Schieber would continue their activism in pushing for the death penalty to be repealed. Vicky's anti-death penalty activism took her to more than 20 states to tell Shannon's story, and her story of her experience with the justice system. In a display of extraordinary grace, Vicky has also said that she wanted to talk to Troy Graves. I want him to know that we aren't angry people with all sorts of vengeance. We want him to find peace. In 2011, Vicky was named as Abolitionist of the Year by the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. This case is as infuriating as it is heartbreaking, from the way sex attacks were handled to knowing how much Shannon had fought for her life. It is tragic to know that it took something so awful with so many victims for the systems to finally change. Troy Graves will spend the rest of his life in prison for what he did to these women, and there is perhaps some solace in knowing he will never be able to hurt another woman again. As Sylvester said, the hardest thing to accept is that our daughter did everything she could to call for help. Shannon was a good person who went out of her way to help almost anyone. The one time she needed help, the system didn't work. But one positive thing to come from all of this tragedy is the amazing compassion and work of the Schieber family. For them to hold true to their principles, show such grace and strength, and not seek revenge in the face of such an appalling crime is frankly incredible. Shannon Schieber had her whole life ahead of her, and who knows what amazing things she would have gone on to achieve. But for her to accomplish all that she did in her 23 years is a testament to who she was as a person. As Vicky said, if you could have written down a wish list and said, "Dear God, this is what I would love for my first child," I got everything on that list I would have wanted.